Hello everyone, my name is Zuhaib. In this video, we will discuss some of the new updates in version 1.2 of slides and grids. The most interesting one is animating the grid randomly, and some others like an additional transform preset for each grid item to transform or animate any grid item manually, offsetting the rows or columns progressively, targeting the layers by selection in the bulk edit dialog, and some additional utilities for the grid. First of all, some of you might have noticed a slow speed issue while changing grid control properties in the newer version of After Effects, which is caused by the new properties panel as it constantly updates itself with the new values from the grid layers. So you can close properties panel from here or from here inside the Windows menu. You can show it again later. This way you can work with the grids faster. If you don't know how delay works, then check out the complete creating grids tutorial first, then you can continue with this video. I'll provide the links in the description. We will only discuss random delay method, which is new in this version. There are a few changes in the arrangements for some of these controls, and let's discuss those as well. The controls at the top are the main transform controls, and you can use these to transform each grid item. In this update, you can change the Z position of the items as well, which will work if the grid is converted to 3D. Then we have delay properties, where you can choose which grid transform properties you would like to be affected by all kinds of delays. The delay will work on these transform values for each item based on the selected delay method and the number of frames to delay. If you deselect any of these, then only the above transform controls work and no controls work on the disable property from below. Nothing will get delayed unless you change this delay in frames value. You can choose by how many frames an item should get delayed from its previous item. Here are 3 delay methods from which you can choose. I hope you are aware of these two, sequential and distance, but in case you are not, then kindly check the creating grids tutorial. I will start with the random delay method. Let's choose random. The delay methods have indices in front of their names which are added in the current version to make it clear for users to understand their additional controls. Numbers 1 and 2 are mentioned here for sequential and by distance, which means this control will only work for both of these delay methods from this menu. Then number 2 will only work with the distance delay method, and by this you can set the point from where to calculate the distance to delay the grid items. Then we have number 3, random delay options. In the random delay option, these transform values for all the items will start animating at random times within the range of this delay in frames. It will calculate the delay in frames by multiplying it with the number of items, and then from those total frames to delay, it will choose a random frame to start animating for a grid item. Let's check an example, but first I enable delay scale as well. I will animate the opacity from 0 to 100. So add first keyframe with the value of 0 and second with the value of 100. Applying basic easing. If you play with the frames to delay set to 0, you can see all are animating at the same time. But if you increase the delay in frames value, you can see how each item is animated at different times. The same will work for all these transform properties unless anyone is disabled from here. You can change the random seed to set different random times for these items to start animating. If you enable randomize each frame, then the different delay values will be calculated on each frame and items will flicker as it is selecting the random time to animate on each frame. Now check by adding scale keyframes. I add the first one, moving it to start. Now adding a second with the value of 100. Set the value of first one to 0 and play again. You can see how they are flickering while scaling and changing opacity according to their random times chosen in the timeline within the number of frames to delay. The items return to normal values according to their original values at the current random time in the timeline. You can use the position and rotation the same way. Now check by disabling randomize each frame. I am changing the graph a bit for both properties to make the animation smoother. We can also set frames to delay in fractional values to delay less. I set it to 0.7. Let's play again. It is looking better now. These were the main random controls, but we are not finished yet. There are some more amazing controls to create cool animations or transitions without manually animating individual grid items. Let's twiddle open this random values shifter group. What we have discussed above will only randomize the animation timings in the timeline for these keyframes. But here you can apply new random values as well to the existing transform values of the grid. This is helpful if you want to animate the grid items from any random state to their original state to create cool transitions or to randomize any transform property value. Using these influence sliders, you can control the original to random values transition. If these influence sliders values are 0, then it means no random values are applied, and 100 means fully randomized. Let's start with the position. Here we have some additional options to choose in which dimension the random values will be applied. X or Y is selected by default. It will generate random X and random Y values according to the X and Y values here. The Z value will be ignored. The difference between X and Y and X or Y is in X and Y, both values will be randomized for each grid item, but in X or Y, only one direction random value will be applied. Let's animate the grid into the scene. First, I move these keyframes further in time and also reverse these. Now I set X and Y values to 700. You will see no change as the influence is set to 0. The random values will be generated in both negative and positive directions. That means as we have set the value of 700 here, it will go 700 pixels in negative and 700 pixels in positive direction, which will define a range between negative 700 to positive 700, and any random value will be generated between this range for each item separately. We will animate the influence from 100 to 0, add a keyframe, set its value to 100, add second with the value of 0. As the influence is 100, the objects are moved in either X or Y direction randomly. You can see by playing, it may not look good yet, but you can mix with other transform properties. Let's add opacity keyframes with the value of 0 to 100. I convert these to Bezier and change the graph a bit to make it smooth. Now if we play, you can see it is looking a lot better as how they appear and change their positions at the same time without any manual work. We can also make the items disappear using the previous keyframes which we moved further in time. Let's bring those back after 10 frames delay. If we play now, then you can see the items appear and then disappear nicely. The same way these other shift directions work. In X and Y, the items will move in both directions at the same time, which may result in a diagonal movement, as you can see here. You can use X, Y and Z if the grid layers are 3D, and it will move layers in all directions randomly at the same time, which we will discuss shortly. X, Y or Z works the same as X or Y as per our previous example, but it will also generate random values in the Z direction based on this position value and will affect the items if the grid layers are 3D. If we select X only, then it will generate random values only in X direction, negative or positive. The same works for y only and z only. You can also use this random values shifter without any keyframes to place your items randomly in this scene or to randomize any of their other transform properties without animating. To do so, let's convert the grid layers to 3D. You can use this function from the additional utilities dialog. I also remove these keyframes at the beginning. Now select the shift direction to Z only and also set the influence to 100. You can see X and Y values are also set to 700, but they won't work as we have selected Z only in shift direction. Now when I change the Z direction, you can see the items will start moving randomly in Z direction, negative or positive. I set it up to 2500. You can also grab the orbit around cursor tool and move around the scene to see how the layers are shifted in 3D. Now you can also use a camera to animate through the scene however you like. You can also choose X, Y and Z to scatter in all directions at the same time, and can also animate any of these directions with keyframes. Let's add first keyframe with all values set to 0. In second keyframe, set Z value to 2500. I convert these to Bezier keyframes. Now if we play, only Z values will be affected. Let's move these keyframes further. Now if we add a third keyframe after 20 frames and set the X and Y values to 700. Then first Z value will be animated and then the X and Y values at the same time. I adjust the graph to make it smoother. Now check the animation again. You can orbit around the scene to check again. If you animate the influence, then all three values will be affected and will shift back to the original where the influence was 0. Let's add a keyframe for influence when it is 100. Then add a second one to set it to 0, which will revert the randomized values to the grid's original transform values. Convert these to Bezier keyframes and adjust the graph. And if you play now, then you can see the grid is back to its original position. As while the influence is animating, it is overriding the below position animation between these last keyframes. This is just a simple example to show how these controls work, but you can create cool animations by mixing these properties. Let's move on to the random scale values group. I move the work area further and these keyframes as well. The influence slider works the same as above. I set it to 100 so we can see the changes in the values. It also has some direction controls similar to what we have discussed above in position. X and Y will randomize both direction scales in X and Y. If I set the scale value to 50, you can see how the scale is randomized for each item. But if I disable uniform scale shift, then it won't maintain the proportions and will randomize in both directions with different values for X and Y. As you can see here. Here the items are only scaled in X. Before, when the uniform scale shift checkbox was enabled, it was using the same scale X value for scale Y. But after disabling it, the scale Y value slider is now in effect and is set to 0, hence creating no random value for Y. But if I change the Y value to 50 as well, now you can see the Y direction scale is also randomized. Then we have X or Y, which will randomize either in X or Y direction based on these X and Y values, not both at the same time, so it won't maintain the proportions. It will generate different random value from 0 to 50 for X and different for Y for each item, but will apply only in one direction, and the other direction will have the original scale value. In X only, it will randomize only in X direction. And in Y only, it will randomize only in Y direction. I set it back to X and Y and enable uniform scale shift checkbox. You can decide how much you want to randomize the original scale value based on this scale value of grid items. Whatever value you set in scale shift X or Y, it will affect the original scale value in both directions, negative and positive. So if you set the value of 100 for scale shift X, then it will create a range from negative 100 to positive 100 to generate random values that will be subtracted from the original scale value. As our original scale is set to 100, it will be randomized between 0 to 200 after subtracting the range for both directions. 0 to 100 is in negative as compared to the current original scale, and 100 to 200 is in positive direction from the original scale value. If you don't want the items to get bigger than their original scale, then subtract the random scale value from the original scale value. So this way the positive random value won't exceed the original scale value and will generate the maximum random value equal to the previous original scale value. You can animate the influence or the scale shift X and Y sliders to animate between original and random scale values. I set the influence back to 0 and move forward to the rotation controls. I set the influence to 100 to see the changes. Now if I change the rotation shift value, you can see how the items are rotated randomly in both directions. Whatever value we set here will rotate the items in both directions, negative and positive, with a random value between this range. Let's say you set 90 degrees as rotation shift. It means it will generate random rotation values between negative 90 and positive 90 degree angle. I set the influence back to 0 and check the opacity controls. All the above controls generate values in both directions, negative and positive. But in opacity shift, the original opacity will be affected and randomized by the amount you set here. I set the opacity shift influence to 100. Let's say you set the value of 50 here, which will randomize the original opacity by 50%. I reset it back to 0. So these were all the controls for the random values shifter. You can randomize the grid items using these values or can animate from the random state to the original state. In this new update, you will also find a new transform controller on each grid item layer, so it is easier now to override the grid transformation and you can easily animate any item manually. You can also move an item in Z space using this value and in XY as well. You can change scale, rotation and opacity too. If we now move around the camera, you can see the layer is on top of other layers. You need to enable 3D switch for the Z axis to work. You can also use this grid utility convert to 3D to convert the whole grid to 3D with just one click. You may also notice that the feature layers like masks, strokes and backgrounds are also moving with the grid item. But for any purpose, if you don't want to move these, then you can use the transform effect. Now if you change the position from here, you can see the item is moving inside the frame but not the frame features. And the item is disappearing due to the mask being in its place. This way you can also reposition any item if you want to adjust manually. Like we can scale or rotate the item and can also reposition to show a different area of the grid item. There are also some new utilities added for the grid. The first one is reset all SG transformation, which will reset all transformations you have done on any grid item by using SG transform preset. It will also remove the keyframes as well, as you can see here. The other ones are hide and show all grid layers. It will either hide or show the current grid completely. This is helpful if you want to work with the multiple grids and want to hide or show any of these. It is also faster than this default layers visibilities and states because it resets the other grid states as well, not only the visibility. If you are using the old grid version which you created using old version of this script, then you can update your grid as well to update its presets to use the new grid controls with it. You need to click on this button while holding the Alt or function key which describes force update expressions only, which actually updates all the grid expressions but will also look for older version of the grid and update that as well. Just click this and it will ask to update if it detects the older version. Click yes to continue. Once done, now you have the latest grid controls, updated grid expressions and the SG transform preset on each grid item to manually transform it. In the grid controls preset, there are also some new controls for progressive shift of grid rows and columns. If I change the value for shift X, you can see how the rows are moving in X direction and each next row is moving faster than the previous one in a group of 2 rows, because we have set here 2 in number of rows and columns. But if I set the value to 3 here, then it will move 3 rows with progressive speed. You can set it as you like. You also may have noticed that when we moved the layers forward, it created some gaps here because we don't have any additional items there. To fix this, you can move the whole grid backward or roughly to the center using grid transform controls. So you will get some margins on both sides. Now you can easily animate progressive shift values. I add keyframe after 4 seconds and a second at the start with the value of 0. Now play to check it. You can see how the rows are animating. You can increase the overall speed by this multiplier value, or you can reverse the speed distribution by enabling this checkbox. Before, the next row was moving faster than the previous ones, but now first row is moving faster than the next rows. You can use a negative value as well to animate in the negative direction. You can also shift the columns using this Shift Y slider. And all these controls will work for this as well. You will find some additional options in the bulk edit dialog as well. The first one is the selection modes. Now you can choose if you want to make changes in the active composition only by enabling active comp. It will disable all unnecessary controls. This way you can easily edit the layers in the current composition to bulk add, remove, replace or change visibilities for these. You can replace grid items with new items using replace method. In active comp selection mode, some behaviors have been set as default. The distribution is set to per layer for the replace method, so each selected project panel item will be replaced with the individual layers. I select these 5 items to replace with. Now to target the layers to replace, I search them by name. As these all have the word landscape in their names, so I type it here. Now if we click replace, you can see the first 5 items are replaced with the selected 5 items because repeat items checkbox was disabled. I undo this, but if I enable repeat items and replace again, you can see the project panel item selection has been repeated to replace all the found target layers with the word landscape in their names. As the default distribution is per layer, so each item has been replaced with a single layer. But for any purpose, if you want to use just one item to replace all layers, then select that one item from the project panel and click replace. You can see now all target layers have been replaced with a single item. All multi-comp settings are the same as in the previous version of the script. To learn more about these, you can check bulk edit compositions tutorial. Find the link in the description. I undo the replacement. The next addition to the bulk edit dialog is the capability to set the target layers by selecting them. Before, we targeted these layers by searching within their names, but this time let's select these layers that you would like to be replaced. I select these 3 layers randomly. Now I select the items in the project panel. When I click replace, you can see the selected layers have been replaced with the selected items from the project panel. You can also select multiple target methods, but it will only target layers when all will match. Which means if you have enabled target by selection and with name at the same time, then it will only target those layers that are selected and also have the specific text in their names. The same works for the other target methods combinations. So these were all the new updates available in the latest version of Slides and Grids. You can check in-depth tutorials to learn more about any of these dialogues and options or the grid. I will leave the links in the description. Have a good time and see you soon.